Console, online. HPG connection, online. Educational module, online. All systems, nominal.
Hello, class, and welcome to On the Origin of Battlemechs Podcast, episode 19. Today we are talking about the Ostwar, and I am your host, Brent Stewart McKee. My co-host today is...
I'm Joshua.
So today's topic is the Ostwar, which is a mech I'm hoping I'm pronouncing right. It's got the design quirks of being easy to maintain, and it has a very interesting design. It is considered the first mech to have the walking pod design, which would be copied and is influential in other designs, both within the company that manufactured it and without. The most notable models to be historically influenced by this one are, of course, the Ostrach and the Ostsol.
Yeah, and the pod here, if you were just looking at the Ostwar, you could be forgiven for thinking the pods were referencing the hands, but the walking pods had to do more with the egg-shaped nature of the torso region. On the originals, in the Ost Soul and Ost Rock back in the early TROs. It literally looked like an egg on a couple of legs with a couple of arms sticking out.
Yeah, so definitely that's where the pod in the walking pod came from. So the first model was the OWR-2M, and it was first built in 2470 by Ostman Limited. I'm noticing a naming convention. Ostman Limited is a Terran hegemony company, and due to the resource issues, the line did not roll out as planned. The full production started in the year 2500. It was unimpressive when compared to other designs on the market. This led the Ostwar to being exported to the Free World League and the Capellan Confederation with the Terran government's blessing, which is interesting.
Yeah, this feels like, hey, you took, looks about 30 years between prototype and the early production to when they started exporting. Your F-16 is not up to our F-22 standards, but we'll let you sell them to the poor people down the street.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting considering the Terran government had a stance of being a diplomatic superpower and not trying to escalate things, so having an arms export seems counterintuitive. But then again, real-world financials, politics, economic systems, things just don't shut down overnight.
Yeah, and we're starting to see battle mechs proliferating at this point. So the Capellans are actually the only ones we haven't had a mech for yet, and they're coming up pretty quick. The Terran Hegemony has a fairly sizable stable of designs. The Fed Suns has a couple.
Yeah, they have at least 10 other designs we've talked about, which are all very notable and stuck around on the battlefield well after the government collapsed, so that shows how resilient their designs were.
Yeah, and we've seen, two for both the Lyrans and the Fed Suns.
We've seen at least one for Karita, and we covered our first Free World League last week.
Yeah, so at this point, it's no longer top secret technology, and this Ostwar 2M is still rocking primitive tech, and I think we've started to see some non-primitive tech debuting at this point.
Well, it's at the very end of the primitive tech era. So we see, it's got a lot of potential, but it just, it's that game that came out on the last console generation right at the end, and it uses all of the capabilities, but it's still the old console generation.
Yeah, there's a problem when you are the last great game to come out on a console right before it swaps over to the next generation. You get superseded pretty quick.
It's true. That being said, there are a lot of gems that you can find in the real world we're talking about now, like Shadow of the Colossus. It was a end-era PS2 game, and that thing's amazing. There's something to be said for being able to use every trick and technique that you've discovered over the time, but when you're making a weapons platform, that's different than making a video game.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing, I just looked up the Banshee real quick, and the 3E, the first non-primitive version, debuts 5 years after the Ostwar, just reinforcing this whole by 2500.
It's standard tech now.
Yeah. And so this 2M just doesn't quite cut it.
But, it does have one thing going for it. It's easy to maintain.
That is not something you give up lightly in the military.
No, and that's why this mech stuck around for a good long time in service, despite its very limited run. So it's got a SRM-4 in the right arm, a SRM-4 in the left arm, it's got a LRM-20 in the right torso, and 2 medium lasers in the left torso. It's got a movement profile of 3, 5, and 12 single heat sinks. I like it. It seems nice. It's not going to handle that heat super well, but as we've covered many times before, primitives rarely do, and you're also going to be bracket firing. You're probably not going to be unleashing both the SRM-4s and the LRM-20 at the same time because, of course, the minimum range on the LRM-20.
Yeah, and he's really slow for a 65-tonner. Granted, this is primitive tech, and they're all slow. So I love the art for this guy.
Oh, yeah. I love the cockpit view screen. It just looks great. Very kind of pilot craft / almost like 1950s car, like concept car.
Yeah, I was going to say like 1930s, the whole era of streamlining.
Yeah.
Even considering it as a primitive, I don't really like this design. He's got that one LRM-20 to dish out firepower at range, which it's a solid weapon. Got nothing else that matches up. And then he's got the 2 medium lasers and 2 SRM-4s, which want to be up close and personal, but he's got a 3-5 movement profile, which makes getting up close and personal difficult. And once he does get up close and personal, that LRM-20 becomes useless.
Yeah, it's got a lot of potential, but it still needs some refinement.
I hope there's a Jihad era design that either gives it MRMs or MMLs or both. But this design was capable enough, even as a primitive like we talked about, and with its kind of uncertain role, it was still capable enough with that heavy LRM-20 that the Merrick forces used it as part of their campaign against the magistracy of Canopus during the War of Cameron Aggression, also known as the Reunification War, which is the first war fought by the Star League after its founding, and basically started because the ruling member of House Cameron felt that as the hereditary ruler of Earth, he was the rightful ruler of all humanity, and the rest of the House Lords didn't know how they were going to stand down their large military-industrial complexes and preferred to turn it on some poor innocent victims who didn't deserve getting crushed under the boot heel of tyranny.
It was very much the Roman-style form of governance and expansion. We're gonna butt up against you for a while until you're like, oh, this is not working out for us. Okay, how about we ally? Okay, well, now someone else is butting up against us, so you're gonna help us beat them in, and then they're gonna ally, and just constantly expanding out from Terra till eventually you hit the critical point, which was the Reunification Wars, where all of the periphery was like, we don't like this, stop. With much harsher language.
Yeah, and ironically enough, that war designed to stave off that kind of downsizing of the military and refocusing the economy and society. After the war was fought, there was no one else to go stave in the face of. So they wound up having to scale down anyway. And that really spelled the doom for the Ostwar, which was 100 years old at that point, still using primitive tech. And as the militaries scaled down and cut back their numbers, the Ostwar was one of the first mechs to get shuffled off to the boneyard.
Yep. So it's got a battle value of 1205 and a point value of 34.
And this 2M actually lives on both literally and figuratively in the designs of the Ostrocht and Ostsol, in that they borrow heavily from the design language and layout, but they also have a lot of parts interchangeability with the standard tech components of the Ostwar.
Yeah, their design philosophy is part and parcel the same, and so often you can find in the historical notes and records other mechs sporting a Ostwar arm that has been replaced because while the Ostwar it came from was no longer salvageable, its parts were still good and universal with several other machines, so you wouldn't junk them.
Yeah.
And that's of course how we get Frankenmechs, which I generally abhor, but in this case I'm like, okay, you know what, you've lampshaded it, I'll give you that one.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't even consider them Frankenmechs so much as you've got the same exact arm actuator in the Ostwar, the Ostsol, and the Ostrocht, ripping them out of an Ostwar in the boneyards that you can't really feasibly used because it's got a primitive engine and primitive armor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're making the same actuator at the same factory for a different mech.
You work with what you got. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying, whenever I hear about Frankenmechs that are like several parts stapled together, I'm like, ugh.
I abhor the Frankenmech concept. You don't take the engines from an F-22, slap them on the front end of a MiG-25, and throw the wings of a F-16 on it and call it a day. Like, you're just not going to be effective if you can even fly at all. Battlemechs are just as high-tech and just as finely tuned and balanced war machines as a fighter.
The precision engineering that goes into these machines is incredible, and you can't just slap that together.
Yeah, and that's before you get into the electronics and software issues.
Oh, software issues.
So I understand they're part of the universe, and they do exist, and there are crazy...
I'm just glad they're an exception.
Yeah.
So, as you mentioned, we get the 2MB after this one, and it is a 2620 upgrade, and it was used during the Reunification Wars. This guy, I like a lot more. It's definitely a different loadout, definitely changing the role. It's got a movement profile that has been upgraded, thank goodness, to 5.8. It's got 18 double heat sinks, so it can vent 36 heat. Why do you need that many? Well, I'll tell you why you need that many. It's got 3 ER large lasers, one in the center torso, one in the right torso, and one in the left torso.
Okay, minor correction. 2620 is after the Reunification War.
Oh, all right. So this is a upgrade that happened after the Reunification War.
Yeah, and that B is kind of the clue that this is a post-Reunification War height of the Star League design, because the B generally denotes that it's a royal design.
Right, of course. There is just so much shorthand in this universe, it's hard to keep track of it all. But that's what we're here for, so you don't have to. We can give you all the notes. So it got rid of the LRMs, but to supplement its missile loadout, it upgrades the SRMs to SRM-6s in both the right and the left arm. It can generate a total of 44 heat just by alpha striking, which is a lot, so that explains all the double heat sinks. Obviously, you're not going to want to be alpha striking all the time, but this is a nice mech. I like it. It's got endo steel, it's got an XL fusion engine, which is not always the best, but, you got to pay for that tonnage somehow.
Yeah, and that's really the trade-off, firepower and armor versus internal protection.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, you just have to take the risk.
I mean, with the 3 ER large lasers, you're going to want to keep your distance with this guy, because it's not particularly fast, so staying back and picking away at things seems like a good plan, and then when something gets too close, that's when you open up with the SRMs.
Well, to be honest, that 5.8 movement profile, or 86 kilometers an hour on a 65-ton mech, is pretty fast for a heavy.
Yeah, you know what? You're right.
I mean, that's a 55-ton medium speed. 65-tonners up through 75-tonners, you're usually looking at a 4.6 or 64 kilometers an hour. And yeah, you can definitely stay back and snipe with those 3 ER large lasers, but they don't have a minimum range.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't mind getting up close and personal.
Yeah, if they were PPCs, you'd be de-incentivized to close, whereas with no minimum range, there's no de-incentivization.
Yeah, you get to 6 hex range. Now you're at medium range for your 2 SRM-6s and short range for your 3 ER large lasers. You can dish a lot of hurt.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, you're going to heat up really fast, but we've talked about how the mech warriors in universe don't mind warming up the mech a little bit compared to players who stay heat neutral as much as possible.
Yeah. So this guy's got a battle value of 1638 and a point value of 40.
And then we get a 455-year hiatus on the Ostwar.
Mm-hmm.
Largely due to the destruction of Ostman Industries during the Successioners.
Yeah, like many manufacturing companies during that time, they simply went up in atomic smoke.
Yeah, and the Succession Wars, we keep mentioning it, but I don't think we've ever actually covered it.
Mm-hmm. But luckily, that is our subject for our Data Dive later in the episode.
Right, so... yeah, we get in 3075, the Ostwar 3M breathes life back into this original walking pod. It was built by the Principality of Regulus. For those of you who haven't heard that name before, it's one of the constituent nations that makes up the Free Worlds League.
In fact, one of the founding members.
However, by this point, the Free Worlds League has been torn asunder by revelations during the Jihad that the ruler of the Free Worlds League was actually a stunt double, basically.
Body double.
Well, body double, stunt double. And the actual ruler was a cripple who was the mastermind of some of the worst atrocities and most dangerous enemies that the galaxy saw during the Jihad. So that's why this is a Principality of Regulus design rather than a Free Worlds League design.
Yeah, and the fall of the Free World League is definitely something we'll have to cover in a data dive all its own, because that is a pivotal moment in history, or more specifically, a good chunk of a pivotal moment in history.
Yeah.
So this guy was manufactured by Ronin Inc. on Wallace, and they were unable to keep up with the contracts coming in to support their line, so they reactivated the Ostwar line with the upgrades in 3075. It's got light ferrofibrous case, ECM, and double heat sinks. It's got a Guardian ECM suit in the center torso. It's got an LRM-20 with Artemis 4 in the right torso, 2 ER medium lasers in the left torso, a Streak SRM-4 in the right arm, and a Streak SRM-4 in the left arm. So those SRMs are back down to 4, but they're upgraded to Streaks, which I like, because, you know, you're always going to hit with all 4 missiles.
Yeah, this thing goes straight back to that original Ostwar design and says, hey, what can we do with the 2M with modern technology?
It's also got a movement profile of 4.6, and it's got 12 double heat sinks.
Yeah, that 4.6 is just logical extension of not using a primitive engine.
Didn't get the upgraded engine like the 2B, but this guy still can move.
Well, I mean, that's a point in its favor for survivability.
Oh, absolutely.
I think the 2M had, 10.5 tons of primitive armor, and this guy's rocking 11.5 tons of light ferrofibrous armor.
Yeah.
As someone who likes to treat Battletech as a war game, the fact that this guy is rocking almost a full complement of electronic warfare type systems, Artemis 4 on the LRM-20, Streak technology on the SRMs, and an ECM suite. I like this design. It's a straight upgrade.
Yeah, it's just the original pumped up with all the new tech, and it's hard not to love this design. It looks good, it moves at a respectable speed, it's got good armor. I like it. I mean, it's not going to have issues with overheating because you can alpha strike for a total of 22. So that, again, it's heat neutral. It's very well designed, very well balanced.
Yeah, and I know I said I didn't like the weapons combination on the original 2M. The LRMs and the SRMs didn't really play well together. But on this one, I think the ER medium lasers is what makes the difference for me.
Okay.
Because instead of having that same range profile as the SRMs, the ER medium lasers have a slightly longer range. They are 4.812 instead of 369. So their medium range overlaps with the short range of the LRM without getting into the LRM's minimum range. So this guy goes, I want to be a mid-range fighter. I'd like to stay at 7 hexes if possible, but if they get too close, if they're a little too fast for me and they close the distance faster than I can back up, well, I'll just switch from my LRM to my Streak SRMs, and not a big deal.
And if it needs to close, it has that ECM to help it out. So, like, honestly, it really feels to me like it wants to hover right at that 6 hex distance.
Yeah, it's an interesting range bracket because it's a very much middle range, but at least it knows where it wants to be.
Yes. So it's got a battle value of 1557 and a point value of 44. Next we come to pilot profiles. Our first pilot for today is Lieutenant Senior Grade Miles Block. He is the commander of Fire Lance in Gold Company for the 3rd Regulan Hussars. He was known for spearheading a rearguard action against Orient troops, holding off more than a company with his LRMs in 3084. It is believed he will receive a promotion for this action, and that is the last we heard of him. Did you have anybody on your list?
No. Ostwar is a relatively new mech in terms of game lore, even though it's the first of the Ost series, so there's not a lot of pilots for it.
Well, there is one other pilot I was able to find. Colonel Michelle Ryan, the princess by marriage of the Principality of Regulus, and commander of the 1st Regulus Hussars in the 3060s to early 3070s. When she married Prince Titus of the ruling family, he gifted her a newly built Ostwar as their wedding present. She was assassinated by the Word of Blake in March of 3077 while pregnant with their second child. This action was meant to cause emotional devastation to her husband Titus Cameron Jones and the units that she once commanded.
Have we mentioned Word of Blake are not nice people?
I mean, I've heard nothing but good things about them. All of their literature just says the best stuff.
Can I interest you in a high-tech toaster?
You only have to pray to it 3 times a day. So for our data dive today, we're going to talk about the Succession Wars, which is a rather large subject. So we're not going to get into any one in specific or any military action taken during them, but we're going to cover what they are as a era, because it is one of the eras that has the most rich history, but it's also very nebulous. So we thought it would be good to go over that.
Yeah, and since this podcast is aimed not just at long-term Battletech fans who are very familiar with the universe, if not with some of the mechs and the timelines that they came out on, but also brand new players who may be coming in through some of the video games or with this new Clan Invasion Kickstarter, we thought it would be a good idea to cover something that is so foundational to the Battletech universe.
And yet all established players, they talk about it like assumed knowledge, so that can be a barrier to entry that we wanted to open up for new players.
Yeah, so the Succession Wars really kick off after 2780. The Star League goes down in flames starting around 2750. Well, I mean, that's when the Ameris coup happens.
Mm-hmm.
And
basically, the Succession Wars happen after the Ameris Civil War and the fall of the Star League. And they span the time from that event to the return of Kerensky's children, also known as the Clan Invasion, in 3050.
Yeah, and the fall of the Star League saw the destruction of House Cameron, the ruling house of the Terran hegemony and the first lord of the Star League. And General Kerensky not only didn't assume the title for himself, which a lot of his soldiers wanted, but the other house lords didn't see him as a peer, but as a threat to the possibility that they could ascend to the throne of the Terran hegemony and the Star League.
Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the few things that the remaining council agreed upon after the Civil War was finished was that Kerensky was stripped of his position and put out to retirement. They thought he was too much of a threat to even stay in command of any military force.
Which is kind of borne out by the fact he snuck off with all of the troops that they were hoping to bring to their banners.
I mean, their concern was not without merit.
But yeah, so essentially, the first Succession War kicked off because none of the 5 great house lords could agree on which one of them should become first among equals and be the next first lord of the Star League.
Mm-hmm.
Hence the Succession Wars, who should succeed the Camerons as the first lord.
And the first person to officially make a claim, the one who started this chain reaction, was, of course, the Draconis Combine, because they're always going to be the ones to be like, yeah, mine.
That, and they had rather tense relations with the Star League and the Camerons due to some other historical events we've talked about in previous episodes.
The Davin Succession War being one of them.
Yep. The first Succession War was absolutely brutal because at this point, every nation still has access to all of their naval warships that they'd been building during the Star League. They have full access to the output of their factories.
Mm-hmm.
Their militaries are at a peak that was only rivaled during the Reunification War.
Yeah.
Giant armies, giant navies slamming across borders, bombing worlds, grabbing former Terran hegemony worlds, just expanding as fast as they could into each other's territory.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of that was spurred by resource acquisition because there were, always rumors of SLDF stockpiles hidden on this planet or that planet that would cause extended, deployments into the space of governing bodies that they share no border with. There was really just this rabid scramble to grab everything you could. And another thing that's interesting, Josh has touched on it, warships. Warships are not very common in Battletech universe in the current day and age. Even with the Republic, after the clans invaded, no one upped their infrastructure to produce warships. And it's really not a lost technology, but it's a stagnated technology. During the First and Second Succession War, they used that technology to devastating effect. Planetary bombardments were common. The First and Second Succession War really had a scorched earth policy.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't just, hey, I want this planet and the people on it. It was, I need to either own this territory so I can use its resources to protect myself, or I need to deny this territory to my opponent. There's some issues with strategic depth, to where it doesn't make sense for some of the planets deeper inside successor states to have been bombarded.
Mm-hmm.
When you have to travel a couple months to get to a planet and you have to dodge enemy naval forces on the way, odds are you aren't going to make it.
Yeah, like every time you jump, even if it's well-established routes, there's a risk. And if you're jumping to black star systems, as in star systems that are mapped but not inhabited, if you have a malfunction, you could be stranded there forever.
Yeah. And at the same time, the invasions happened so quickly and with such force, thanks to the fact that they had warships to back them up and move large formations. Massive inroads were made into each other's nations early on. And, it's hard to describe just how devastating it was for these worlds, particularly worlds that had belonged to the Terran hegemony.
Mm-hmm.
Because above anything else, they were the prize for the other successor states.
That is assuming that Ameris hadn't burned them to the ground beforehand.
So the First Succession War lasted from 2786 to 2821, so almost 40 years of conflict. The major invasions, once they were turned back and nations mobilized, kind of simmered down to border raids, trying to snatch those caches and stockpiles, destroy support structures.
Mm-hmm.
Second Succession War picks up after that and kind of continues the whole catastrophe of invasion, counter-invasion. That planet produces weapons, so I need it, or I need to destroy it.
Yeah, the Second Succession War really went from a focus of land grabs and denying resources to your opponent to denying your opponent their infrastructure. So during the Second Succession War, you saw a lot of factories and infrastructure get burned. You saw a lot of technical knowledge getting lost, both during the First and Second Succession Wars. And because of that, after the Second Succession War, the Third and the Fourth were a very different affair.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I wonder how much national production and technology was lost during the First Succession War. Because even though it lasted for almost 40 years, it ends more due to war weariness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, war exhaustion.
Yeah, then, a catastrophic can't continue this war physically.
Yeah.
Which leads me to believe, their economies can only run on war footing for so long before they run out of money and, production capacity to continue, regardless of whether or not you're getting bombed.
Yeah.
The Second Succession War, however, sees the entry of Comstar into the secret war to destroy technological and industrial capacity.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because the Second Succession War, how much of that was a continuation of the First Succession War, and how much of that was retaliation for Comstar's secret strikes, and how much of it was Comstar themselves, and how much of the actual long-term damage was inflicted by the combatants, and how much of it was inflicted by Comstar agents.
Yeah. Sadly, it's one of those things that we'll never really know, because it's one of those, lost to the ages sort of things.
Well, and it's one of those things that for this universe to make sense, especially for new players, the technological regression that happens during this time period comes about largely because of Comstar's efforts under Conrad Toyama to restrict the flow of knowledge and to destroy the tech bases of the great houses so that they couldn't produce technology or pass on the knowledge of how to produce technology that they'd had just, a few decades before.
And run wild with. So for me, I really contextualize the four succession wars as one conflict, but they never, the period between the first and the second succession war was not a peace, it was an armistice,
Yeah. I mean, technically, the world is still at war with North Korea.
Well, wasn't it just a couple decades ago that Russia and Japan were like, oh yeah, we're still at war, oops.
Yeah, there was another one. was it the Dutch and the Canadians who are still technically fighting over an island?
Oh, no, I know the one you're talking about. We both have claim to it, and how we fight is we will show up, remove the other person's flag, and leave a bottle of alcohol for them when they show up to remove our flag and put theirs back up. They'll leave some alcohol for us.
Yeah, that's not actually a declared war, so that's not the one I'm thinking of. But it's like some island just off the English Channel that was technically the English, and I think it was the Dutch have been fighting. They've been at war over it since like 1620 or something stupid.
There's a million of those things.
So I mean, these succession wars are really kind of that same thing going on. Is hey, we're kind of done fighting because our economies are shot to heck from dealing with the wartime economic measures.
Mm-hmm.
We need a chance to reset and rebuild the civilian side. And then, a decade later, some new person gets into office or some Comstar agent bombs some library and it's back on like Donkey Kong.
Yeah, so like we mentioned, the third and fourth succession wars were very much smaller scale events. They were raiding or, like trying to secure resources, but very little actual territory exchanged hands during those two conflicts. It was mostly just border worlds. There weren't any real deep pushes into other people's territory.
I think the Capellan Confederation would have some...
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, fourth succession, and yeah, you're right. Okay, I'm talking about the third.
Yeah, the third succession war is very much skirmishing.
Yes.
Small units, battlemech hands are hugely important because you're breaking into somebody's warehouse and then your battlemechs are grabbing as many crates as possible and then lighting the rest on fire and running away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a little bit of change of territory in the Fourth Succession War.
Yeah, Fourth Succession War, that's the famous one with Hans Davian and Melissa Steiner getting married and Hans Davian saying, I give you the Capellan Confederation as his wedding present. You thought an Ostwar 3M was a great wedding present. Hans Davian gave away half of the Capellan Confederation as his wedding present.
Look, I'm just glad my wife doesn't read the books because then I would have never been able to show him up at my wedding. Yeah, no, that's, but the Fourth Succession War also was a little different because they had started to rediscover some lost memory cores, allowing them to rebuild infrastructure and make technology that had been lost. So that really helped with the ability to expand the theater of war to capturing more territory.
Yeah, and that's one reason I bring up Comstar, is because that renaissance is largely started by the discovery of the Helm Memory Core by the Grey Death Legion, and that's part of the Third Succession War, and Comstar is very much the bad guy there.
Yes, they are very much trying to remove, if not the Grey Death Legion from the field, that memory core from the field.
So the First and Second Succession War, if you wanted to sum them up, would be kind of like the First and Second World Wars. The Third Succession War, I don't know if it has a good historical context that most of our listeners would be familiar with, because it very was much a war of raiding and counter-raiding rather than the all-out destructive land-grabbing conquests of the First and Second Succession War.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Fourth Succession War is if the good guys understand Blitzkrieg and the bad guys don't, and half the bad guys' country gets taken in the first couple of years of fighting.
And the leadership of the bad guys' country is completely inept.
Yes. Not just militarily, but politically as well.
There's a lot to talk about with Maximilian's mental state at every point in the Battletech history.
One could say there's a lot to talk about the mental state of Liao at every point in Battletech history.
Yeah, like the main leader we see in the fiction from the classic narrative is Sun Tzu, and he is an exception. He is not the rule. He is really good at what he does, but he came from a pit of vipers, and it's amazing he was able to keep everything together that he did.
Yeah, one has to wonder, did the crazy gene escape him, or did he just figure out how to channel it?
Well, there is that classic episode of Star Trek where Kirk gets split in half and, there's the evil side and the good side. And, you got to have that little bit of toughness to be an effective commander and leader. So probably tapped into it.
Yeah, I think that wraps up the data dive on the Succession Wars. Hope it helped some of our listeners.
And if you have any questions or wanted us to expand on a specific event or anything like that, or go into something else, please do let us know, because we'd love to hear back from everyone. Sources?
Sources.
Our sources today are Sarna, Battletech Battlemech Manual, Master Unit List, TRO Primitives Volume 1, Record Sheet 3075, Unabridged, On the Cutting Edge, and 3085 TRO, and Jihad Hotspots 3076, and then all the Battletech novels that I've read over my life.
Yeah, my source is my big brain.
Yeah. We are supported by our Patreons at patreon.com/on the Origin of Battlemechs. Our social media on Twitter is at Origin of Mechs. We also have a dedicated channel on the Everything Battletech Discord. Feel free to stop by and say hi. If you have any questions, requests for topics, or wish to contact us, our email is ontheoriginofbattlemechs@gmail.com. If you enjoy the show, I encourage you to let your friends know about us and to leave a review. Special thanks to my friend Laura for the intro and outro. Class dismissed. Everybody have a great day.
Peace out, Mech Warriors.
Module complete. System standby. Would you like to load the next module?
Sidebar, have we covered what the different types of Pharaoh for Boris armor are in the last one, right? Or in a previous one?
We have covered it piecemeal. It's like the ECM. It was one of the ones that I was like, okay, we should probably have
okay.
This is what that is. I put it on the list.
Okay, data dive for armor.
Yeah, data dive for armor later on.